What if the crown finally decided there would be no more bargaining? Not no more interviews. Not no more statements. No more negotiations. Period. Picture this for a moment. A monarch who has waited a lifetime for the throne. A reign already shadowed by illness, public doubt, and a monarchy struggling to define itself in a modern world. And across the table, not physically, but symbolically, a duchess who walked away, built a global brand on that departure, and now, according to whispers, wanted back in on her own terms. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is not a fairy tale. This is not even a family dispute anymore. This is a power struggle. And according to palace watchers, insiders, and those familiar with royal history, something snapped. Because what if the problem was never whether Meghan could return to the UK? What if the real issue was what she allegedly demanded in exchange? Money, status, recognition, and a form of royal legitimacy that the crown itself may no longer be willing to grant. Ask yourself this: how much is a royal title worth when it becomes a bargaining chip? And more importantly, what happens when the king decides that the price is too high? Tonight's story isn't about gossip for gossip's sake. It's about leverage. It's about timing. And it's about a moment when King Charles, a man often criticized for hesitation, is said to have reached a point where hesitation was no longer an option. Because if the reports are even partially true, this wasn't a casual request. It wasn't a quiet olive branch. It was a demand package, carefully framed, strategically timed, and delivered at a moment when the monarchy was vulnerable. So let's slow this down. Imagine being King Charles. Your reign is still being defined. Your legacy is unfinished. Your mother's shadow still looms large. And then, just as the dust begins to settle, negotiations resurface. Not apologies. Not reconciliation for family's sake. Negotiations. And here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because negotiations imply power on both sides. They imply that both parties believe they have something the other needs. So the question becomes unavoidable. What did Meghan believe she had that the king could not afford to lose? Public sympathy? Media leverage? The narrative of exclusion? Or something deeper? Something symbolic that strikes at the very heart of monarchy itself? Royal insiders have long said that the modern monarchy survives not on force, but on consent, on public belief, on the illusion of stability. And if that belief is threatened, even subtly, the crown reacts. But not always loudly. Sometimes it reacts with paperwork. Sometimes it reacts with silence. And sometimes, if the stakes are high enough, it reacts with an order, an emergency order. Now, let's be clear about one thing before we go any further. Much of what we're discussing exists in the realm of reports, leaks, interpretations, and palace-adjacent commentary. The royal family does not confirm negotiations. It does not acknowledge demands. And it rarely corrects narratives unless absolutely necessary. That silence, it's intentional. And in royal culture, silence often speaks louder than any press release. So when stories began circulating that Meghan was allegedly open to returning to the UK under specific conditions, financial, symbolic, and status-related, it raised eyebrows. Not because reconciliation is shocking, but because the terms reportedly attached to it were. Think about that contradiction for a moment. Leaving the royal family to escape its constraints, only to negotiate a return that reinforces those very structures. Is that irony or strategy? And this is where viewers like you need to pause and ask, who was really negotiating here? Was this about healing family wounds? Or was it about control over narrative, brand, and legacy? Because royal status isn't just ceremonial. It carries weight. It shapes perception. It opens doors. And in the age of streaming deals, speaking tours, and global media platforms, that weight converts into something very real: influence. So if someone wanted to return to the UK with royal acknowledgement intact, perhaps even enhanced, the crown would need to ask a brutal question. What precedent does this set? And more importantly, who pays the price? King Charles has always been described as emotional, sensitive, even hesitant. But he is also a monarch who understands one thing better than most. History remembers decisions, not intentions. And history does not care how uncomfortable those decisions were to make. So when reports suggest that negotiations stalled, not gently faded, but hit a wall, that tells us something important. It tells us that the issue wasn't misunderstanding. It was refusal, and refusal from the crown is rare. Because the monarchy survives by compromise. Until it doesn't. Ask yourself, when was the last time the royal family truly drew a line and said no more? Not delayed, not deflected, no more. To understand why this moment matters, we have to understand timing. This didn't happen in a vacuum. Public sentiment has shifted. Fatigue has set in. Audiences who once leaned forward for every royal revelation now lean back with folded arms. Sympathy has limits. Attention has limits. And when leverage begins to shrink, demands can suddenly feel louder, sharper, riskier. And for a monarch already under scrutiny, those risks become unacceptable. Because if King Charles allowed negotiations to continue under pressure, it wouldn't just look like compromise. It would look like surrender. And monarchy cannot survive surrender. So according to multiple royal commentators, what followed was not anger. It was calculation, not rage. Resolution. A realization that whatever was being asked, whether money, status, recognition, or symbolic restoration, crossed a line that could not be uncrossed without damaging the institution itself. And once that realization set in, the tone changed. No more soft language. No more back channels. No more hopeful pauses. Just a decision. But before we get to that decision, before we talk about documents, orders, and consequences, there's something else we need to address. Prince Harry. Because every negotiation has a silent variable. And Harry, by most accounts, was that variable. Was he leading the discussions? Or was he watching them unfold? Was he advocating? Or absorbing? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, did Harry still have influence, or had that influence already slipped away? When a son stands between his wife and his father, there are no winners. Only fractures. And fractures, once exposed, are hard to hide. Which brings us back to the moment everything changed. Not a speech, not an interview, not a viral clip, a request. Or depending on who you ask, a demand. And when King Charles saw what was allegedly being asked for next, the room went quiet. Because at that moment, the question was no longer whether Meghan could return. The question was whether the monarchy should allow itself to be negotiated with at all. And that's when a line was drawn. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What was the demand that made the room go quiet? Because according to people who track the monarchy closely, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a poorly worded request. And it wasn't something that could be smoothed over with time or better PR. It was specific. It was deliberate. And it landed at the worst possible moment. This is the point in the story where most people assumed things got loud. Arguments, raised voices, emotional blow-ups. But insiders say it was the opposite. It got very, very quiet. This phase of our story begins not with shouting, but with stillness. Because when a demand freezes a palace, it's usually not because it's outrageous in tone. It's because it's dangerous in implication. So let's talk about that moment. Picture the setting. Not a dramatic throne room scene like in the movies, but something far more modern and unsettling. Advisors reading, phones buzzing, documents being reviewed, language dissected line by line. No theatrics, no emotion, just calculation. And then a pause, a long one, because what was being asked wasn't just money. It wasn't just status. It was leverage. Ask yourself this. When someone asks for something they know you can't easily give, what are they really asking for? Control. According to multiple royal commentators, the alleged demand package contained 3 elements that immediately alarmed palace officials. Not because they were unprecedented on their own, but because of what they represented together. First, there was the financial component. Now, let's be careful here. No official figures have ever been confirmed. But the chatter was persistent enough to raise eyebrows across the royal press ecosystem. The implication wasn't support for security in the abstract. That debate had already happened, publicly and painfully. This was different. This was framed, allegedly, as compensation tied to a return. Compensation not just for costs, but for inconvenience, for risk, for brand damage. Think about how that lands inside a monarchy that prides itself on duty. Returning isn't supposed to come with an invoice. And that's where the discomfort began. Because once money becomes part of reconciliation, reconciliation stops being emotional and starts being transactional. And monarchies do not survive transactions that look like ransom. But the financial aspect, unsettling as it was wasn't the real problem. The second element was status. Not symbolic gestures. Not private courtesies. Status recognition. And here's where things get tricky. Royal status isn't just about titles printed on stationery. It governs precedence. It dictates how someone is introduced, where they sit, how they are acknowledged in public and private spaces. And according to whispers, what was being requested went beyond a simple acknowledgement of existing titles. It hinted at elevation, at restoration not just of position, but of relevance. Ask yourself this. If someone walks away from an institution publicly, criticizes it repeatedly, and then negotiates a return that enhances their standing, what message does that send? To other royals? To future spouses? To the public? It tells them that leaving loudly pays. And that is a precedent the crown cannot afford. Because the monarchy doesn't just govern people. It governs perception. And perception, once cracked, spreads fast. But even that wasn't what truly froze the room. It was the third element. The one that didn't read like a request at all. It read like a condition. An implication that without agreement, something else would happen. Not stated outright. Not threatened openly. But felt. Because when negotiations are framed with urgency, timing becomes a weapon. And timing, in this case, was everything. King Charles's health had been under constant media scrutiny. Every appearance dissected. Every absence amplified. Every cough speculated about. The monarchy was already vulnerable. So when a demand arrives during that vulnerability, even if unintentionally, it lands differently. It feels like pressure. And pressure changes the rules of engagement. This is where royal advisors reportedly began to worry less about the demand itself and more about what agreeing to it would signal. Because monarchy, at its core, is about continuity. And continuity does not respond well to ultimatums. Now pause for a second and ask yourself something uncomfortable. If the roles were reversed, if the crown had demanded conditions for reconciliation, how would that be perceived? Cold, controlling, punitive. So what happens when the perception flips? When the institution becomes the one being asked to concede? That's when advisors start using words like line and limit. And that's when discussions shift from emotional resolution to institutional protection. Because here's the contradiction at the heart of this chapter. The alleged demand was framed as a way forward, but it felt like a power grab. And those two things cannot coexist peacefully. King Charles, by all accounts, listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explode. He didn't react publicly, which, if you understand royal behavior, is far more ominous than anger. Because silence from a monarch is rarely indecision. It's assessment. And what he was assessing wasn't just the request. It was the future. What does the monarchy look like if this is accepted? What does it look like if it's refused? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, what does it look like if nothing is done? Because doing nothing is also a decision. And sometimes, it's the most damaging one. Royal aides are said to have gone back and forth on one specific issue, precedent. Not Meghan specifically, not Harry personally, precedent. Because once a demand is met under pressure, it becomes a template. And future conflicts will point back to it. This is why monarchies move slowly. This is why they resist emotional decision-making. But there comes a point where slow becomes dangerous. And this was one of those points. Now let's talk about Harry, because his presence, or lack thereof, speaks volumes. According to those familiar with royal dynamics, Harry was not leading these discussions in the way many people assume. He wasn't dictating terms. He wasn't issuing demands. He was present, but not central, which raises a deeply uncomfortable question. Had Harry become the subject of negotiations rather than a participant in them? Because when a husband and wife are perceived as operating with different levels of influence, power shifts quietly, and the palace notices. There's another detail that often gets overlooked in this story. The monarchy doesn't respond well to being rushed. Urgency suggests instability, and instability threatens legitimacy. So when advisors reportedly sensed that time was being used as leverage, whether intentionally or not, alarms went off. Because if the crown responds under pressure, it looks reactive. And a reactive monarchy is a weak monarchy. This is where King Charles's personality becomes critical. He is not impulsive. He is not theatrical. But he is deeply conscious of legacy. He waited decades for this role. He inherited not just a crown, but a fragile institution in a changed world. And in that moment, The alleged demand didn't feel like a path toward healing. It felt like a test of how far the crown could be pushed. And tests demand answers, not negotiations. Answers. So when people say the palace froze, they don't mean it stalled. They mean it recalibrated. Behind the scenes, the tone changed. Language hardened. Options narrowed. And the conversation quietly shifted away from, how do we make this work, to, how do we protect the institution? Because once the monarchy enters protection mode, outcomes become far less flexible. Now here's the twist most people don't consider. This moment wasn't just about Meghan. It was about the monarchy's relationship with modern power. Celebrity power, media power, narrative power. And the crown had to decide whether it would negotiate with that power or confront it. History shows us that monarchies rarely survive by accommodating challenges to their authority. They survive by outlasting them. Which brings us to the most telling part of this chapter. After reviewing the alleged demands, King Charles did not respond immediately. No counteroffer, no soft refusal, no public gesture, just silence. And in royal terms, silence is never empty. It's a signal that the matter has moved beyond family, beyond emotion, beyond compromise. Because once the crown stops negotiating, it doesn't announce it. It acts. But before we get to that action, before we talk about meetings, advisors, and the word emergency entering the conversation, there's one more thing you need to understand. This demand wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was what it revealed. It revealed that both sides believed they still had leverage. And when two sides believe that at the same time, collision is inevitable. And the collision was closer than anyone realized. Because while the world focused on headlines and speculation, something else was happening quietly inside the palace. Something procedural, something irreversible. And when that next step was taken, there was no going back. But what came next would shift the balance of power entirely. And it started with a realization that stunned even seasoned royal insiders. So here's the uncomfortable question that sat heavy in the air after the palace went quiet. What was Meghan's price to return? Because once the initial shock faded, once the advisors stopped rereading the same lines over and over, the realization began to sink in. This wasn't a spontaneous idea. This wasn't emotional outreach. This was structured, layered, strategic, and strategy implies intent. This story isn't about outrage. It's about unpacking the logic behind the alleged demands. And why? To the monarchy, they felt less like reconciliation and more like a recalibration of power. Let's start with the contradiction that nobody wanted to say out loud. Leaving the royal family was framed publicly as an escape, an exit from rigid rules, suffocating expectations, and institutional control. Freedom was the word used again and again. So why would returning require conditions? And not just any conditions, but ones tied to money, recognition, and authority? That question haunted palace insiders. Because when someone asks for terms, it suggests they believe they are returning from a position of strength. And that belief changes everything. According to persistent reports, the concept of returning was never described as permanent. It wasn't a full reintegration into royal life. It was conditional presence. Appearances. A foot in the door. And here's where things get interesting. A conditional return allows you to take without fully submitting. You get proximity to the institution without surrendering autonomy. You get the optics without the obligations. Ask yourself honestly, doesn't that sound like the perfect arrangement for someone building a global personal brand? This wasn't about living quietly on palace grounds. It was about controlled access. And controlled access is power. Now let's talk about money. Because money always makes people uncomfortable in royal discussions. The monarchy survives on a delicate balance between public funding, private wealth, and symbolic restraint. It is supposed to look dignified, not transactional. So when financial considerations reportedly entered the conversation, they weren't treated as practical necessities. They were treated as philosophical threats. Because money tied to return isn't about security costs. It's about valuation. It answers a question no royal ever wants to answer openly. What is someone worth to the crown? And once you assign a number, you strip away mystique. Royal advisors reportedly bristled at the framing. Not because money itself is taboo, the royal family deals with money constantly, but because this money was attached to presence. Appear and receive. That's not duty. That's performance. and monarchy does not perform on demand. But even within the financial aspect, the real tension wasn't the amount. It was the reasoning. If the justification was compensation for risk, reputation, or exposure, then the implication was clear. The crown was being asked to acknowledge liability. And that's a line it never crosses willingly. Because if the monarchy admits liability once, it invites endless claims. But still, money alone wouldn't have ended negotiations. What truly unsettled advisors was how money and status were linked. Because status, unlike money, cannot be negotiated without consequences. Royal status dictates hierarchy. It defines who bows to whom, who enters first, who stands closest, who speaks on behalf of the institution. It is not cosmetic. So when reports suggested that any return would require not just retention of titles, but active acknowledgement of rank and relevance, alarm bells rang. This wasn't about being called Duchess in private. This was about being recognized in public, official contexts. And that recognition carries implications far beyond optics. It signals legitimacy. Now pause and think about this. If someone who has criticized the monarchy repeatedly is officially welcomed back with status intact, or enhanced, what message does that send? It tells the world that opposition is tolerated, rewarded, even. And that is a dangerous precedent. Because monarchy, unlike celebrity culture, does not thrive on reinvention. It thrives on continuity. So when advisors looked at the alleged demands, they didn't see a pathway to healing. They saw a blueprint for disruption. There's another layer here that's often overlooked. Public perception. Even if the crown could internally justify concessions, how would it look externally? The public had watched the interviews, the documentaries, the accusations. Would they accept a return that looked transactional? Would they believe it was genuine? Or would it feel like capitulation? Because perception is the monarchy's currency, and once spent recklessly, it's hard to replenish. This is where irony creeps in. The very thing that made Meghan powerful outside the monarchy, her independence, her narrative control, her global platform, is what made the idea of her return so complicated. Because the crown could not control the story anymore. It could only react to it. And reaction is weakness. Now let's talk about leverage, because that word is unavoidable here. Every negotiation has leverage. The crown's leverage lies in tradition, symbolism, and continuity. Meghan's leverage lies in narrative, attention, and timing. And timing, in this case, was brutal. The monarchy was already under pressure. King Charles's health was under scrutiny. The public was restless. The institution was in transition. And a return, even a limited one, could have been framed as unity, stability, healing, but only if the terms were controlled by the crown. When the terms appeared to be coming from the outside, the narrative flipped. Unity became concession. Healing became compromise. And compromise, when it looks forced, erodes authority. Here's something that rarely gets discussed. The monarchy does not fear criticism. It fears irrelevance. And any deal that strengthens an external figure's relevance at the expense of the institution's authority is a threat. So when advisors reportedly examined the full scope of the alleged demands, they began asking questions that had nothing to do with Meghan personally. They asked institutional questions. What happens next? If this return works, what stops future departures followed by negotiated reentries? What stops other royals from leveraging public sympathy? What stops the monarchy from becoming reactive instead of stable? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what happens if the crown says yes and loses control anyway? Because there was no guarantee that any agreement would bring silence, or loyalty, or restraint. The crown has learned, painfully, that once narratives escape, they rarely return quietly. This brings us to Harry again, because his position in all of this was uniquely fragile. Harry had once been the bridge, the son who could soften edges, the emotional conduit between wife and father. But now, according to observers, that bridge looked strained. Because if Harry supported the demands, he risked confirming fears that he had fully aligned himself against the institution. And if he didn't support them, he risked something far more personal. So where did that leave him? Some say silent. Some say sidelined. Others suggest he simply didn't have the influence people assumed. And that realization, that Harry might no longer be the key negotiator, shifted dynamics dramatically. Because once negotiations are perceived as coming from one side more than the other, empathy collapses. And empathy is essential to compromise. Without it, discussions become defensive, protective, rigid. This is when palace language reportedly changed. Words like return and reconciliation began to disappear. They were replaced with words like exposure, risk, and precedent. That's not the language of healing. That's the language of defense. And once defense mode activates, outcomes narrow fast. Now here's the part that most people miss. The alleged demands weren't just about gaining something. They were about setting terms. And setting terms implies authority. The monarchy can share space. It can share platforms. But it cannot share authority. Because authority is the monarchy. So when King Charles absorbed the full implications of what was being asked, he wasn't thinking about headlines. He was thinking about history. About how this moment would be interpreted decades from now. About whether his reign would be remembered as adaptable or weak. And that's when the conversation shifted from "can we do this?" to "should we allow this?" There is a profound difference between those two questions. And once the second question is asked, negotiations rarely survive. Because "should" invites moral judgment. And moral judgment is unforgiving. This is where the alleged demand to return became something else entirely. It became a catalyst, a moment of clarity, not about Meghan's intentions, but about the monarchy's limits. Because limits, once identified, must be enforced. Otherwise, they aren't limits at all. So while the world speculated about money and titles, something deeper was happening. King Charles was redefining where the line stood. Not publicly, not emotionally, but decisively. And that decision didn't begin with punishment. It began with preparation. Meetings were scheduled. Advice was sought. Legal frameworks were reviewed. And a word that had not been used lightly began to surface in quiet conversations. Emergency. Because once you frame a situation as requiring emergency response, you are no longer negotiating. You are acting. But before any order could be signed, before any authority could be exercised, one thing had to happen. The king had to reach certainty. Certainty that compromise would cause more harm than refusal. Certainty that doing nothing would be worse than acting. Certainty that the institution could absorb the fallout. And when that certainty arrived, it did not come with drama. It came with resolve. But the most shocking part of all, the decision that followed wasn't triggered by the biggest demand. It was triggered by the realization of what agreeing would teach the world. And that lesson was unacceptable. Because once the crown teaches the world that pressure works, it invites endless pressure. And that is something monarchy cannot survive. So as Chapter 2 closes, understand this. The price to return wasn't just financial. It wasn't just symbolic. It was institutional. And King Charles was about to decide whether that price was worth paying. But what happened next didn't involve Meghan directly at all. It involved advisors, closed doors, and a conversation that would change the tone of everything that followed. Because once the word emergency enters the room, history is about to move. And no one, not Meghan, not Harry, not the public, was ready for how fast it would move next. Was Prince Harry still part of the conversation? Or had he quietly become the reason it was falling apart? Because once the focus shifted away from Meghan's demands and toward the mechanics of power, one truth became impossible to ignore. Harry was no longer standing at the center. And that realization changed everything. Chapter 3 begins with absence. Not physical absence, but strategic absence. The kind that's far more revealing than any public statement. For years, Prince Harry had been the emotional bridge, the translator. The son who could explain his father to his wife, and his wife to the institution that raised him. He once had leverage simply by existing between two worlds. But now the palace wasn't asking what Harry wanted. They were asking where he stood. And that's a very different question. Because in royal dynamics, clarity matters more than loyalty. And ambiguity is dangerous. Let's rewind for a moment. Harry didn't just leave the UK. He left a role. A position within a hierarchy that had shaped him since birth. When he stepped away, he didn't just walk into a new life. He forfeited institutional authority. That authority isn't symbolic. It's practical. It's access. It's influence. It's the ability to shape outcomes behind closed doors. Once Harry stepped outside the structure, he lost those privileges. And when negotiations reportedly resumed about a possible return, even a limited one, many assumed Harry would naturally lead the charge. After all, he was the blood connection, the son, the bridge. But something unexpected happened. He didn't. According to multiple royal commentators, Harry was present, but peripheral, informed, but not decisive, included, but not influential. And that subtle shift did not go unnoticed. Because in royal families, hierarchy is everything. And Harry's position in that hierarchy had changed permanently. Here's where the emotional contradiction kicks in. Harry is still the king's son, but he is no longer one of the king's working assets. And that distinction matters. It means that when discussions occur about institutional risk, Harry is no longer automatically in the room where final decisions are made. He can be consulted, he can be heard, but he cannot dictate. And that's a painful reality for someone who grew up believing his voice mattered. So ask yourself this. If you're Harry, watching negotiations unfold that involve your wife, your father, and an institution that once defined you, but realizing you're no longer steering the conversation, how does that feel? Empowering or humiliating? Because power lost quietly hurts more than power taken loudly. Now consider how this looked from the palace's perspective. They weren't dealing with a united front. They were dealing with two separate forces. One loud, one quiet. And quiet, in this context, was not reassuring. It raised questions. Was Harry fully aligned with the demands? Or was he simply unable to stop them? Was he advocating or acquiescing? And perhaps most troubling of all, did he still understand the institution well enough to see the consequences of what was being asked? These questions weren't asked out of malice. They were asked out of necessity, because the monarchy cannot negotiate with uncertainty. And Harry, unintentionally or not, had become uncertainty personified. Let's talk about silence. Harry's silence has always been complicated. Sometimes it signals restraint. Sometimes it signals conflict. But in negotiations, silence can be read as consent. And that's where things became dangerous. Because if Harry did not publicly or privately counter the alleged demands, the palace had to assume he supported them. And if he supported them, then the negotiation was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a stance. And once something becomes a stance, compromise becomes far less likely. Here's the emotional spike most people miss. Harry was no longer perceived as the son seeking reconciliation. He was perceived as the husband allowing leverage to be applied. That's not an accusation. It's an interpretation. And in high-stakes institutional settings, interpretation is reality. This is where the emotional temperature drops sharply. Not anger, disappointment. Because disappointment is colder than rage. And far more final. King Charles, by all credible accounts, did not blame Harry publicly or privately. But that doesn't mean he didn't adjust expectations. There's a difference. He began to treat Harry not as an internal stakeholder, but as an external factor. And once that happens, dynamics shift dramatically. External factors are managed, not accommodated. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If Harry had stood firmly against the demands, openly, unequivocally, would this story be unfolding the same way? We'll never know. Because what the palace saw was hesitation. And hesitation in moments of pressure is interpreted as weakness, especially when history is involved, especially when legacy is at stake. Harry's internal conflict, torn between wife and father, may be human. But monarchy does not operate on human terms. It operates on institutional logic. And that logic had already begun to override emotion. There's another layer here that adds complexity. Harry's previous public statements had already strained trust. The interviews, the memoir, the allegations, all of it had created a narrative where Harry was seen less as a reconciler and more as a participant in critique. So when negotiations allegedly resurfaced with conditions attached, the palace could not ignore context. Context matters. And context was not on Harry's side. Because trust, once eroded, is not restored by silence. It's restored by action. And action, in this case, was missing. Now let's flip perspectives for a moment. From Harry's point of view, this situation may have felt impossible. Speak out and risk damaging his marriage. Stay quiet and risk losing his family. Either way, he loses something. That's the tragedy at the heart of this chapter. Harry was trapped. But institutions don't pause for personal tragedy. They move forward. Which brings us to a crucial turning point. At some stage, and insiders disagree on exactly when, the palace stopped framing Harry as a negotiator entirely. He was no longer the messenger. He was no longer the intermediary. He became part of the equation to be managed. And once that happens, decisions accelerate. Because now the crown isn't trying to preserve a relationship. It's trying to preserve itself. And that distinction is everything. This is where King Charles's mindset shifted decisively. Not emotionally, strategically. He began to ask a different set of questions. Not, how do I bring my son home? But what does my son's position mean for the monarchy? That's a brutal shift, but a necessary one for someone wearing a crown. Because a monarch cannot afford to prioritize one relationship over an institution that has existed for centuries. And once that realization settles in, family becomes secondary. Not irrelevant, but secondary. That's a hard truth. And it leads us to the moment where things began to move very quickly. Because once Harry was no longer seen as the key to resolution, the palace freed itself from hesitation. There was no longer a need to tread softly, no longer a need to wait for alignment, no longer a need to hope for a breakthrough. The breakthrough had already happened, just not the one anyone expected. The breakthrough was clarity. Clarity that reconciliation on these terms was not possible. Clarity that continuing discussions risked legitimizing pressure. Clarity that inaction would be interpreted as weakness. And clarity, once achieved, demands response. This is when the machinery of monarchy began to turn. Quietly, deliberately, relentlessly. Meetings became more frequent. Advice more formal. Language more precise. Words like family began to disappear from internal memos. They were replaced with words like authority, precedent, and exposure. And once that vocabulary dominates, outcomes become predictable. Now here's the twist. Harry may not have known any of this was happening. That's the most painful part. Because while the palace recalibrated, Harry remained in emotional limbo. Not informed, not included, not consulted in the way he once would have been. Because once the crown shifts into protection mode, transparency narrows, and silence becomes policy. So Harry's role in this story isn't that of a villain. It's that of a sidelined figure watching forces larger than himself move without him. Not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, the cold kind, the kind that creeps up slowly behind diplomatic smiles and polite silences. And then suddenly, something snaps. And what snapped wasn't a relationship. It was the illusion that one could still be salvaged. For decades, King Charles was labeled many things. The sensitive prince, the overthinking heir, the man who waited too long to rule. But when he became king, something changed. Not overnight, not publicly, but internally. Responsibility replaced patience, and legacy replaced sentiment. So in this negotiation, this allegedly bold and calculated demand from Meghan to return to the UK under her terms landed in his court. Charles didn't flinch. He studied it. He waited. And then, according to insiders, he made a decision no one expected from him. He decided there would be no more compromises. This wasn't personal anymore. It was constitutional. Let's unpack what that really means. Because when a monarch reaches his breaking point, it's not a temper tantrum. It's not reactive. It's not theatrical. It's strategic. It's final. You see, Charles had watched decades of palace turmoil. The Diana years, the Fergie scandals, the endless tabloid wars. He knew the cost of hesitation. He also knew the cost of action. But this time, action was the only option left. According to palace insiders, after reviewing the full scope of Meghan's alleged financial and status-related demands, paired with the timing, the media temperature, and the monarchy's current vulnerabilities, Charles reached a chilling conclusion. If he gave an inch, the institution might crumble under the weight of precedent. Because this wasn't just about Meghan. This was about future royals, future crises, future headlines. If this type of leverage worked once, it would work again. And the crown, already bruised from decades of scandal management, couldn't survive being rebranded as a bargaining chip. So Charles, quietly but firmly, drew a line. And this line would become the hinge point for everything that followed. Let's pause here and ask something raw. Have you ever been pushed to the edge of your patience not by rage, but by exhaustion? Not the kind where you want to explode. The kind where you just stop caring about being understood. You move from accommodating to decisive. From explaining to executing. That's where Charles was. Not angry. Resolved. This was his monarchy now. And he would not allow it to be redefined on someone else's terms. Even if that someone was the mother of his grandchildren. even if that someone was married to his son, even if that someone once called him Pa. Because when the crown speaks, it doesn't whisper through emotion. It declares through action. And King Charles, in that moment, decided that the monarchy would not be negotiated with. Not this time. But here's where it gets fascinating. Rather than announce this publicly, rather than leak it to the press or use the usual media machine, Charles went internal. Deeply internal. He called in his top advisors, legal minds, constitutional experts, royal secretaries, and one thing became crystal clear. This was now an institutional matter, a matter that required protocols, frameworks, and ultimately, consequences. This wasn't going to be a statement. It was going to be an order, but not just any order, an emergency measure. And that word, emergency, carries an enormous weight inside palace walls, because it bypasses the usual layers of hesitation. It signals urgency, crisis, point of no return. And the breaking point that Charles reached wasn't just about Meghan's demands. It was about the future. Could the monarchy survive if this situation were allowed to spiral? Could Charles ever regain control of his reign if he didn't stop this now? Could he, in good conscience, hand over this chaos to William one day? The answers, in his mind, were clear. No, no, and no. So he gave the signal that hadn't been given in years. Emergency measures were to be drawn up. And that's when the real machinery of monarchy, the hidden engine that the public never sees, roared to life. Behind the scenes, everything changed. Meetings that had been advisory became strategic. Language that had been cautious became sharp. And Charles, often accused of dithering, became a monarch no one recognized. He was clear. He was firm. He was done. Let's talk about one moment in particular. A senior advisor, reportedly shaken by the change in tone, asked the king one final time if he wished to reconsider, if perhaps a final appeal to Harry might soften the ground. Charles didn't shout. He didn't pace. He simply asked, and what happens when they come back again with new terms? That question hit like a cold wind in the room, because it cut through every remaining illusion. This wasn't the end of a negotiation. This was the end of a cycle of compromise, a cycle of narrative dominance, a cycle of emotional blackmail masked as reconciliation. And Charles was finished with it. He had reached the point that monarchs reach when they realize their survival depends not on being liked, but on being respected. And sometimes, respect requires finality. So the decision was made. There would be no public negotiation. There would be no secret payment, no ceremonial return. There would be a document, signed under royal authority, structured to remove ambiguity. An official order to remove the final piece of leverage left, the royal titles. Now understand, this isn't just about the words Duke and Duchess. It's about identity. It's about prestige. It's about the ability to command attention, respect, and influence in rooms all over the world. Stripping those titles doesn't just alter how someone is addressed. It alters their global brand. And that's why this decision was not made lightly. Because once those titles are gone, they cannot be reclaimed without a full institutional reversal. And that never happens. So when Charles prepared to authorize the order, he wasn't just drawing a line in the sand. He was burning the bridge behind him. Ask yourself something now. Why didn't he do it sooner? Why wait until now? The answer is chilling in its simplicity. Because up until now, he still believed there was something left to salvage. Some final thread of hope. Some last ember of dignity that could be rekindled. But that ember died with the latest demands. With the tone, the timing, the assumption that the crown could still be persuaded, if the price was right. And when that illusion finally died, Charles didn't just react. He reset. He stepped fully into the role he had spent his life preparing for. Not as a father, not as a grandfather, as king. And the king decided it was time to act. Not emotionally, not vindicatively, institutionally. Because the monarchy isn't about family. It's about survival. And survival, in this moment, meant taking action that no one else had the courage to take. Not out of hate, but out of clarity. But what happened next wasn't just a signed order. It was a total recalibration of how the palace would engage with the Sussexes and the outside world from this moment forward. And that recalibration would silence years of speculation. Because once the order was issued, the message would be clear. No more bargaining. No more threats. No more negotiations. But the specific contents of the emergency order? That's where things took an unexpected and irreversible turn. Because it didn't just remove titles. It removed something far more powerful: access. And that change would reverberate through the monarchy in ways no one could predict. Not even the king himself. Because when an emergency order is on the table inside Buckingham Palace, everything changes. The pace, the tone, the hierarchy. And this time, King Charles wasn't just signing a symbolic piece of paper. He was commanding the crown to defend itself. Let's rewind to the moment it began. It started, oddly enough, with a calendar adjustment. Senior aides cleared 3 days of public engagements from the king's schedule without explanation. No illness was cited. No scheduling conflict offered. The media barely noticed. But inside palace walls, a message had been sent. The crown was about to move, and when it does, it clears the battlefield first. According to insiders, these days were used to convene the Royal Privy Council's inner legal team. The very same legal minds who helped craft precedent-breaking decisions during Queen Elizabeth's reign, including constitutional advice during royal divorces, abdication fears, and threats of defection. In short, this wasn't a casual meeting. This was DEFCON 1, monarchy style. Phones were taken, printers locked. Briefing notes were hand-delivered in sealed folders marked personal, eyes only. Because once the word emergency is invoked under the royal charter, confidentiality becomes a constitutional necessity. Now let's get into the room. What were they actually discussing? Not just the titles. Not just the removal of Duke and Duchess of Sussex. They were weighing a legal and symbolic containment strategy. One that would forever change the royal rules of engagement with any member who steps away but attempts to maintain influence. Because the problem wasn't just Meghan and Harry. The problem was the pattern. Step away. Monetize. Criticize. Negotiate return with added demands. If that worked once, it would be attempted again. By future spouses. By cousins. By heirs not first in line. And the monarchy cannot afford a blueprint for controlled rebellion. So the advisors proposed something radical. An emergency revocation framework. A set of procedural tools the king could use to immediately suspend, strip, or deauthorize royal designations and privileges when a member of the royal family acts in direct conflict with the crown's interests. Think of it like a kill switch. One royal historian called it, quote, a firewall against brand exploitation disguised as royal duty. And King Charles didn't blink. He ordered it to be drafted. Immediately. Now here's where things get real. Stripping titles isn't just about changing what the press calls someone. It changes legal standing in foreign territories. It affects visa privileges. It affects diplomatic reception. It affects whether a royal can legally present themselves as a representative of the crown in any context: charity, media, political lobbying. So yes, removing Duchess of Sussex sounds symbolic. But removing the legal entitlement to operate under that banner? That's a power cut. And that's exactly what this emergency order was designed to do. Not just disassociate. Deactivate. Here's what insiders say the emergency order included. Immediate and permanent removal of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles from all official registers and ceremonial contexts. Legal notification to Commonwealth governments that Meghan Markle may no longer be introduced or hosted under any form of royal status. Cancellation of remaining UK-based royal privileges, including formal invitations, palace staff liaisons, and security waivers. Final restriction of access to royal archives, personal correspondence, and family documents unless approved by the reigning sovereign. But the most chilling line? No future negotiations authorized. That was it. For words. And with those words, the door slammed shut. Because for years, both sides had operated under the assumption, the illusion, really, that at any time, there could be a way back. Some quiet back channel. Some shared interest. Some redemption arc. But now it was official. Not personal. Not emotional. Procedural. And once something becomes procedure in the monarchy, it becomes permanent. Let's pause here. Do you realize how unprecedented this is? Even Prince Andrew, disgraced and exiled from public life, was not subjected to this level of official severance. Why? Because he didn't try to use his scandal as leverage. He didn't attempt to bargain for return. He retreated. He disappeared. And the crown left the door open, barely. But Meghan's alleged re-entry demands? They crossed the line. And Harry's silence? It erased the bridge. So the king acted, and the fallout was immediate, but not in the way most expected. There was no press briefing, no leak, just a palace-wide lockdown on communications regarding the Sussexes. Staff were instructed to use new internal language. Not "Their Royal Highnesses," not the Duke and Duchess, just the couple. No initials, no titles, no trace. It was as if the monarchy was digitally erasing a folder from its system, wiping it clean. So why such a scorched earth approach? Because the order was never just about removing the titles. It was about eliminating the possibility of leverage ever again. And that required total containment. Because here's the twisted truth. You cannot negotiate with someone who believes they can still win. You have to make them realize, without saying a word, that the game is over. That's what this emergency order did. It didn't just block the door. It bricked it shut. And what makes this so devastating? Meghan and Harry likely never saw it coming. Because the palace gave no warnings. No final letters. No farewell phone calls. No olive branches. Just silence. And then, one morning, certain titles disappeared from official listings. Diplomatic liaisons were paused. Social calendars updated. Ceremonial invitations rescinded. And the world began to notice. Royal reporters were first to see the signs. Suddenly, Duke of Sussex vanished from internal briefings on royal succession. One Commonwealth official reported that Meghan's name was quietly removed from the VIP guest list of a major diplomatic event. And yet, no one inside the palace would confirm the change. Why? Because the monarchy doesn't need to explain itself. It just moves. And when it moves this decisively, that movement becomes the explanation. So let's ask the real question. Did Charles regret it? Not from what insiders say. In fact, those closest to him said the king looked lighter. Not gleeful, liberated, as if a lingering infection had finally been cut out. And when one aide nervously approached the king the day after the order was signed, asking whether he'd hear from Harry soon, Charles reportedly replied, "We've heard enough." 6 syllables. A full stop. Because that's what this order was. A full stop. But here's what no one saw coming. The emergency order didn't just end the Sussexes' royal relevance. It created something far more dangerous. It created a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed questions, speculation, and worst of all, retaliation. Because the next move wasn't the crown's. It was Meghan's. And what she did next would ignite the very fire Charles thought he'd extinguished for good. What do you do when the door slams shut, so hard it echoes? You knock louder? You walk away? Or do you light a match and burn the house down? Chapter 6 begins not with a whisper, but with a ripple. A ripple that grew into a tidal wave the moment Meghan realized what had just happened behind palace walls. Because let's be very clear, the emergency revocation order wasn't just a royal statement. It was a declaration of war. And the person it struck hardest wasn't even in the same country. Meghan Markle, actress, activist, former working royal, and now the face of an exiled duchy, did not issue a press release. She didn't go live on Instagram. She didn't grant Oprah Part 2. She did something far more calculated. She went silent. And that silence, once again, spoke volumes. Because when someone used to controlling the narrative suddenly goes dark, it doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. Let's be blunt. For Meghan, the title of Duchess of Sussex wasn't just a formality. It was a currency she'd spent cautiously and brilliantly across platforms, negotiations, and high-profile appearances. Every charity partnership, every podcast deal, every guest list she appeared on, those weren't just about her name. They were about her position. And now, that position had been erased. Publicly, she stayed composed. Privately, insiders say she was furious. Because here's the bitter truth. Meghan didn't expect to be denied. Dismissed, maybe. Delayed, sure. But outright revoked? Never. And that's where the real twist begins. Because what happens when someone who's built a global empire around a royal identity suddenly loses the very title that made it bankable? They pivot. But they also plot. Insiders from Meghan's camp, speaking off the record, as always, say there was an immediate flurry of activity after the emergency order dropped. Phones rang. Publicists huddled. Strategy decks flew into revision mode. Because Meghan didn't just lose a title. She lost positioning. The Duchess persona had been an integral part of her post-royal branding. Soft power. Aristocratic glamour. The woman who walked away, but could still hold court. Now, she was just Meghan, and just Meghan wouldn't cut it for the circles she wanted to dominate. So, a new plan was born. Some insiders believe Meghan began exploring alternative pathways to power, routes that didn't require royal validation but would still give her global clout. Media ownership, political commentary, philanthropic leadership, and most controversially, diplomatic ambitions. Yes, sources say Meghan began asking questions through intermediaries about what it would take to become a U.S. ambassador to a UN-affiliated position. Think about that. Not a return to the UK, not a royal rebrand. A power leap, straight into international politics. Some called it bold, others, delusional. But in Meghan's mind, she wasn't retreating. She was evolving. But even as she charted new waters, one thing remained constant. The wound. Because despite the headlines, the PR, the spin, Meghan wasn't prepared for what that royal order felt like. It wasn't just rejection. It was erasure. And that's where the danger lies. Because someone who feels erased becomes unpredictable. That unpredictability worried palace insiders. What if Meghan retaliated? What if she finally named names? What if she went fully scorched earth? This fear wasn't theoretical. Remember, Meghan still had access. Not to the crown. Not anymore. But to the public. And public sentiment, especially outside the UK, still leaned in her favor. All she had to do was speak. Once. And the narrative could shift in seconds. So the palace braced for impact. But impact didn't come in the form of a statement. It came in the form of a strategy leak. A subtle, deliberate whisper to a major U.S. outlet. Meghan was deeply hurt by the palace's abrupt decision, especially given her outreach behind the scenes to find common ground. Translation? This wasn't just a power play, it was an emotional betrayal. And more importantly, she was laying the groundwork for plausible victimhood. Not a villain, not a schemer, but a woman who tried, who reached out, who was shut down. It was a brilliant move, because it reframed the narrative just enough to reignite sympathy. And just like that, the chessboard reset. Charles had acted. Meghan had countered. And caught in the middle was Harry. Because while Meghan was strategizing publicly, Harry was reeling privately. Sources say the emergency order hit him like a freight train. He knew things had been deteriorating, but he didn't expect his father to formalize the break. To sign something so final, so legal, so irreversible. It felt like exile. Because it was. Friends close to the couple said Harry spiraled emotionally in the days that followed. Not because of the titles, he never cared much for those, but because of what it meant. His family had officially closed the door. No more negotiation. No more maybe one day. No more illusions. And worse, he hadn't seen it coming. Some say he felt used, by everyone. By the monarchy that kept him in the dark. By the wife who led the charge. And perhaps even by the world, which demanded he choose a side, and then punished him either way. This internal chaos left Harry silent. Visibly absent from public life. No podcasts. No appearances. No statements. And that silence was deafening. Because now the crown had moved. Meghan had countered. And Harry? Harry was adrift. But the tension wasn't over. Because Charles's emergency order had consequences far beyond Meghan and Harry. It triggered shockwaves across the royal family. Camilla? Quietly relieved. William? Focused but cold. Princess Anne? Reportedly furious that it took this long. And the Queen Consort staff? Finally, we can breathe. Because despite the drama playing out publicly, the real storm had been internal. The family, fractured for years, could now unify around a shared clarity. The Sussex chapter was closed. No more tiptoeing. No more placating. No more hope. But just as the monarchy began to stabilize, a new threat emerged. One that no one expected. A single legal loophole buried deep in the royal succession documents. One that, if activated, could undo everything. And Meghan? She may have just discovered it. What if the door wasn't as locked as the monarchy thought? Chapter 7 opens not with defiance, but with discovery. Because as the crown exhaled, relieved that the emergency revocation order had finally sealed the chapter, Meghan's legal team was quietly studying the fine print. And buried deep within centuries-old documents, obscure titles, and tangled royal laws, they found something. A flaw. A legal wrinkle no one at Buckingham Palace had anticipated. And in the hands of someone like Meghan Markle, that wrinkle wasn't just a technicality. It was an opportunity, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand just how dangerous this loophole could be, we have to understand what the order did and what it didn't do. Yes, King Charles had issued an emergency declaration stripping the Sussexes of all remaining royal titles and privileges. Yes, he had invoked a legal precedent that hadn't been used in nearly a century. And yes, it appeared to be permanent. But here's what no one inside the palace expected. The Duchy of Sussex was never fully dissolved. Let that sink in. The titles were stripped. The privileges were revoked. But the ducal estate, in historical and symbolic